Hello, my name is Charlie Spedding. I've worked for most of my life as a pharmacist. I have a Bachelor of Science degree in pharmacy and a few decades of experience as a medical professional. If my name rings a bell, it may be because I used to be an athlete. I have won the London Marathon and I have an Olympic bronze medal in the marathon from the Los Angeles Games. As an athlete, I experienced fantastic health and well-being, and I was always seeking ways to get the very best from my body. As a pharmacist, I witnessed a great deal of ill health and always wanted to understand how the body could be repaired. However, I left pharmacy several years before I had originally intended to because I was very disillusioned and frustrated. A lot of people were coming to my pharmacy with metabolic diseases. They diligently took their medication, but eventually I realized that these people never get better. They are never cured because the drugs are treating the symptoms of disease but doing nothing for the root cause of their problems. This is a fantastic business model for the pharmaceutical industry, but is not good for patients. Since leaving pharmacy, I've spent the last few years researching the true root cause of all these modern metabolic diseases. I had to unlearn a great deal of information that we have all been told. Obesity, heart disease and type 2 diabetes are all lifestyle diseases. And we all do better if we take regular exercise, don't smoke, reduce stress and get plenty of sleep. These things are very important, but nowhere near as important as the food we eat. Our diet has the greatest impact on our metabolic health. The much-loved NHS has told us for nearly 40 years to base our meals on carbohydrates like bread, pasta and potatoes and cut back on fat. These official national dietary guidelines were copied from America in 1983 and represented as a food pyramid originally. The trouble is, this advice is wrong. It is so wrong it has caused the obesity epidemic, the surge in type 2 diabetes and dementia, and has increased the incidence of a variety of cancers, among other things. Bad diet is the greatest cause of disease. It dwarfs smoking, alcohol and physical inactivity combined. In my research, I discovered the amount of misinformation in the world of dietary advice. It is so huge I was compelled to write a book about it. I called it Stop Feeding Us Lies. I'm not here to sell my book. I mention it to give myself some authenticity, to show that I have done enough research to fill a book with all the misinformation and lies that go on to mislead us in the world of dietary advice. Now, someone who has no interest in sport can probably grasp the idea that a successful Olympic marathon runner is the sort of person who does not give up easily. I do not. I continue to search for all the lies we are told by people we are supposed to trust. On the subject of sport, do you remember Sepp Blatter? He was head of FIFA, the world's governing body for the world's most popular sport, football. He has been banned from any contact with FIFA for 6 years because he was corrupt. Not so well known is Lamine Diack. He was president of the IAAF, which is the world's governing body for athletics. He's serving a 4-year prison sentence for corruption. I only mention these two as examples of that old saying, power tends to corrupt, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. That was said by Lord Acton back in the 1880s. There is, however, a more modern version which I am inclined to prefer. It is not that power corrupts, it is that absolute power attracts those who are corrupt. Of course, it isn't just in the world of sport where corruption exists. Sadly, medical science is frequently abused by large corporations, and they do it for their wealth, not for our health. This lady used to be the editor of the New England Journal of Medicine. She says, "It is simply no longer possible to believe much of the clinical research that is published, or to rely on the judgment of trusted physicians or authoritative medical guidelines. I take no pleasure in this conclusion, which I reach slowly and reluctantly over my 2 decades as an editor of the New England Journal of Medicine. Sadly, she is not alone. Richard Horton, as editor of The Lancet, much of the scientific literature, perhaps half, may simply be untrue. Science has taken a turn towards darkness. So who can we trust? Surely our newspapers will tell us the truth. The Guardian, in 2017, was paid $886,600 American by an organization called the Open Philanthropy Project. In return, the Guardian was required to print a stream of articles that painted animal agriculture as inhumane, unhealthy, and dangerous to the environment. So their editorials were bought by this company. We are constantly told the lie that we need to swap animal foods for plant foods for the good of our health and the planet. Well, look at these monsters destroying the environment. And look how plant agriculture works in harmony with nature. Like everything else in life, the debate over food production depends on the details. So corruption exists in sport, medical research, the national media. In what other walk of life might we find the opportunity for corruption? Surely not in a democratically elected British government. Surely not. Well, let's see. Boris Johnson's government has taken some extraordinary measures during its short term in power. In September 2019, he attempted to prorogue Parliament. He wanted to shut it down for 5 weeks so that all our democratically elected representatives would be unable to comment or object to his Brexit arrangements. The Supreme Court unanimously declared this action illegal. This did not thwart his desire to rule by decree and to avoid scrutiny by Parliament. Lord Jonathan Sumption is a retired Supreme Court judge, and he recently said, "The British public has not even begun to understand the seriousness of what is happening in our country. Many, perhaps most of them, don't care and won't care until it's too late." Lord Sumption is referring to this government's attempts to destroy democracy. He has delivered a scathing lecture on the government's unprecedented abuse of parliamentary procedures. There is a video online of his 70-minute talk if you want to see the full details. I have a copy of his speech, and I have reduced it to a few bullet points. The 348-page Coronavirus Act was rushed through both Houses of Parliament in one day, which prevented proper scrutiny. It gave no power to confine healthy people. Centuries of tradition allow for the confinement of infectious people, but not the healthy. A different act, the Civil Contingencies Act of 2004, gives the power to confine healthy people in extreme circumstances, but it requires stringent parliamentary control, and the government didn't use that one. The government used the Public Health Act 1984, which does not require such parliamentary control, but is written in unspecified general words. Lord Sumption emphasises that it is a basic constitutional principle that general words are not to be read as authorising the infringement of fundamental rights. The day after the Coronavirus Act was passed, the Contingencies Fund Act passed through Parliament also in one day. It authorised an increase in contingency funds, giving the government an extra £266 billion. Constitutional principle demands that Parliament should control how public funds are spent. Some of you may think a time of apparent mortal danger allows the government to bend the rules and to force through what needs to be done. The inner circle of the government have given themselves access to vast amounts of money. The question is, how well have they spent it? The budget for Test and Trace is £12 billion. This is a system they use to test thousands of healthy people and confine them in their homes for 2 weeks because they happened to be in the same restaurant as somebody else who tested positive. They need this much money because they're employing over 1,000 consultants from the international consultancy firm Deloitte, and each one of those costs over £1,000 a day. They are not employing experts in viruses and immunity. The head of Test and Trace is Dido Harding. She is a Tory peer and is married to a Tory MP. She was appointed without consideration of other candidates. The Vaccine Task Force is led by Kate Bingham, who has no expertise in vaccines. She was appointed by Boris Johnson, without consideration of other candidates. She is also married to a Tory MP and has spent over £600,000 on consultants to tell her how to do her job. She is in trouble for discussing her work with a group of venture capitalists who can now invest in the companies the government are planning to buy vaccines from. Randox is a company in Northern Ireland. It was given £150 million to produce COVID test kits. Sadly, they all had to be recalled because they were contaminated. Matt Hancock then gave Randox another £347 million to try again. The Tory MP Owen Paterson is paid £100,000 a year as a consultant for Randox. A group of cross-party MPs and the Good Law Project have launched legal action against the government over the trifling matter of a missing £3 billion that cannot be accounted for. There are many more examples, but you get the idea. There are jobs for the boys and jobs for the wives of the boys. There is wanton disregard for financial control and accountancy. This government is undemocratic, tyrannical, financially incompetent and utterly corrupt. But at least when it comes to mortal danger, it listens to the science. This is the typical shape of any viral seasonal epidemic in the winter of a temperate climate like that of Britain. It is known as a Gompertz curve. In tropical latitudes, the rise and fall of infections follows a more shallow but longer lasting curve. This rise and fall of deaths in an epidemic is exactly what an expert should have expected, with or without any interventions. One of the experts the government listened to was Professor Neil Ferguson. We can clearly see the quality of his expertise in his record of predictions. BSE, for example, is mad cow disease, where he predicted 50,000 deaths, and there were 177. How is it possible for a man so bad at his job to be taken seriously? If he worked for a private company whose business needed to predict future trends, he would have been sacked years ago. But he doesn't. He works for Imperial College, the sort of institution where people pay no price for being wrong. Ferguson was on the SAGE committee when he predicted 500,000 deaths and insisted we needed a total lockdown. You may remember he resigned from that committee after it became known he was having an affair and breaking his own lockdown rules. I'll come back to SAGE in a moment, but first let's look at face masks. March the 4th. We do not recommend wearing a mask if you do not have an infection. 23rd of April. The evidence for face masks is very weak. 28th of April. The government position on face masks has not changed. In the same meeting, the evidence from SAGE is there is weak evidence that a mask can prevent a source of infection. 4th of June. From the 15th of June, face coverings are mandatory on public transport, and of course they became mandatory in all public buildings not long afterwards. Why did the government change their minds when the advice had not changed? And a bigger question, why did they become mandatory in June? When this seasonal virus had all but disappeared, why would they do that? There's absolutely no valid scientific reason to introduce masks in June. What is the obvious thing about masks? It is that they are obvious. They are a clear, visible and constant reminder that we all have to stay frightened of this seasonal virus. Surely the government wouldn't introduce measures to keep us frightened. This is from a paper prepared for SAGE. A substantial number of people still do not feel sufficiently personally threatened. the perceived level of personal threat needs to be increased among those who are complacent, using hard-hitting emotional messaging. Why do they want to terrify everybody about the threat? Is it because they knew the second wave would be far worse than the first? This chart looks scary, but there are two things to say about it. One, masks were introduced in June, supposedly to stop the spread. How well do we think that worked? Secondly, this graph is really a type of cheating. These are called cases, which implies the number of infected people, but they are really the number of people with a positive lab test result. I'll explain in a minute why that is not the same thing. In March and April, they were testing people who were ill to see what was wrong with them. This is an entirely normal procedure. But with test and trace and its enormous escalation, we are testing hundreds of thousands of people who are not ill. And if they get a positive result, they are counted as cases of coronavirus. This is the first time in medical history we have classified people with no symptoms among those who are ill. It goes against the very definition of illness. What about the test itself? PCR, polymerase chain reaction. It is a complex process requiring very careful temperature control and techniques. It does not find living viruses. It finds and replicates specific parts of genetic code from the virus. This piece of RNA is put through a series of cycles, and each one doubles the amount of genetic material there. This produces enough material to be detected by the apparatus. However, you do not know whether the genetic material came from a live virus or the remnants of a virus which has already been killed by your immune system. The test cannot tell the difference. This is not a foolproof test for infected or infectious people. The presence of classic symptoms backed up with a positive test is how diagnosis has always been done and how it should still be done. Testing healthy people and declaring some of them ill, without knowing if they are infected, is a deliberate corruption of the truth. Okay, Charlie, okay, but a lot of people have died of COVID. Yes, I do not doubt it. But how many? On the television news, every single night for 8 months, we have been told and shown the running total of people who have died with COVID. This number is a record of how many people died for any reason whatsoever within 28 days of a positive test. So all the people who died of cancer, heart disease, dementia, suicide, road accidents are all included if they had tested positive within the previous month. This has never been done before for any other disease. This is another corruption of the truth. We cannot know how many people have actually died as a direct result of COVID because of this accounting method. This policy is a deliberate act to make the coronavirus appear more deadly than it is. Why? Why would they do that? Anyway, back to the people who have died. Let's put things into context. These are COVID deaths by 5-year age band. 80.4% of deaths were in the over 70s, 61% in the over 80s. More than 50% of the deaths were in people who were older than the average life expectancy. Sadly, most of these were unlikely to live much longer anyway. What else do we know about them? The vast majority of deaths weren't just old people. They were metabolically ill. 95% of all the people who died, all age groups, had at least one pre-existing condition. These include heart disease, diabetes, cancer, dementia. When did Johnson, Hancock, Whitty, Vallance and the BBC ever mention that old sick people die from COVID, and relatively very few others? They constantly imply that this virus is just as dangerous for everybody. Oh yes, Johnson did mention his weight shortly after he recovered from the disease. He realised his obesity made it worse. For about a week, we were encouraged to lose weight to fight COVID. What happened to that story? It just disappeared. As I said earlier, I left pharmacy and wrote a book about how our dreadful NHS-backed diets lead inexorably to metabolic disease. Now these diseases make you much more susceptible to this virus. Still, a bit more context. 50,000 deaths from COVID since March the 1st was a recent sobering headline. But how many people die anyway? In 2018, 616,000 people died in the UK. March to November is 8 months, so 2/3 of a year. 2/3 of 616,000 is 410,000 deaths. 50,000 deaths is 12% of the deaths you would expect. Yes, they are all tragic, but it is hardly Armageddon. We never see a headline saying 360,000 people have died since March, and none of them had COVID. These two people are supposedly leading the fight against the coronavirus. Chris Whitty has had various government advisory jobs for over a decade. Patrick Vallance has been Chief Scientific Advisor to the government since 2018. I have a question for you. What has been the biggest health problem in the UK throughout the last decade? It is not COVID. It is the obesity epidemic and all the associated metabolic diseases that go with it. During their tenure, what have Whitty and Vallance done to rectify that enormous burden on the health of this nation? So far as I can tell, not one single thing. In my opinion, that is negligence. You can always tell a lot about people by what they say, but I reckon you can sometimes tell even more by what they do not say. These two don't talk about the age of the COVID victims. They do not talk about the pre-existing diseases in those people. They never mention the incredible power of our immune systems, nor any of the ways in which we can improve our own immunity. There are very strict rules about placing a piece of cloth over your mouth, but no guidance at all about what you put in your mouth. Our immune system has evolved over millions of years and does a fantastic job to protect us from harm. To function properly, it needs a healthy body and a good diet, which must include certain critical nutrients. Selenium is a trace mineral which we acquire through our food. A selenium deficiency suppresses our immune system and makes us more susceptible to infections. Deficiency inhibits the production of the whole range of T cells, B cells and antibodies. A vaccine triggers the production of antibodies, but if you are selenium deficient, it is not going to work very well. Making sure everybody has adequate selenium should be a priority in a viral epidemic. How much selenium we get depends on how much is in the soil where our food came from. But some of the best sources are Brazil nuts, salmon, tuna, chicken, free-range eggs, mushrooms, beef, sardines, and navy beans. Zinc is another trace mineral. This micronutrient is important for maintenance and development of immune cells of both the innate and adaptive immune system. Lymphocytes and natural killer cells do not form properly nor function properly unless there is an adequate supply of zinc. Studies have shown that people with optimum levels of zinc are far less likely to die from COVID than those who are deficient. The best sources of dietary zinc are shellfish, beef, pork, chicken, free-range eggs, mushrooms, nuts, dairy products, and legumes. Vitamin D has a huge range of benefits in the human body. It has been known for many years that an optimum level of vitamin D considerably reduces the severity of an influenza infection. The flu is another seasonal respiratory virus. Knowing this, some researchers tested the vitamin D status of hospitalized COVID patients and found a clear relationship. The lower the vitamin D levels, the worse the outcome. Properly controlled trials have also been conducted now. Time and again, the studies show a huge benefit of good levels of vitamin D compared to people who are deficient. During winter, in latitudes far from the equator, it is impossible to make enough vitamin D from sunshine. We have to make an effort to get it in our diet. I think we all know that this man is Matt Hancock, the Secretary of State for Health and Social Care. For most of my life, I have been flabbergasted that we have a political system that can put a man in charge of something as important as health when he knows absolutely nothing about it, and also has no scientific background whatsoever. However, we cannot blame the system for the fact that he is also a liar. Earlier this year, the Health Secretary told the Commons that he had ordered a trial that showed vitamin D did not appear to have any impact. Officials now admit that no trials took place. Where do we get vitamin D? Sunshine, when it is strong enough on bare skin, is the best source of vitamin D3. D3 is the active form. Do you remember, during the summer, we were allowed to exercise, but we were not allowed to sit outside in the sunshine, boosting our vitamin D levels. The police would come and move us on, even when we were sitting all alone. You couldn't make this madness up. The best sources of vitamin D from food are cod liver oil, eggs, oily fish, liver, beef, dairy, and of course you can also take supplements. When do you ever hear Hancock, Whitty or Vallance recommending any of these nutrients? Never. I've never heard it. Now, I am not suggesting these will make you completely immune to COVID, but having optimum levels will give your immune system the best chance to fight it off. The silence over this is extraordinary because there is absolutely no downside to having optimum levels of these nutrients. You may have noticed that the great majority of foods listed here are of animal origin. The constant message that we should all be eating plants for the good of our health is a lie pushed by vested interests, but that subject needs a video of its own, which I hope to do in the not too distant future. Please note also that vitamin D is a fat-soluble vitamin, and you need natural healthy fats in your diet to absorb it. And that is something else we are wrongly told to avoid. The government says that it follows the science, and the scientific advice they follow comes from a group called SAGE. There happen to be two groups called SAGE. The World Health Organization has the Strategic Advisory Group of Experts, which advises it on vaccines and immunization. The UK government has the Scientific Advisory Group for Emergencies, which provides scientific and technical advice to support the government decision makers. The current group is chaired by Sir Patrick Vallance and Professor Chris Whitty, and includes experts from within government and healthcare and academia. What a coincidence, they are both called SAGE. One is intended to advise on vaccines, the other seems to be intent on having vaccines as the only solution to the coronavirus problem. They have advised measures to slow the spread of the virus, which have included social distancing, work from home and total lockdowns, where theatres, cinemas, sports venues, pubs, restaurants, cafes and non-essential shops are closed, and we are almost prisoners in our own homes. What do lockdowns achieve? They achieve poverty. Poverty for all the people who lose their jobs and lose their previously viable businesses, and poverty for the country. This government has thrown hundreds of billions of pounds at this problem. Our children and their children will be trying to pay off this debt for their entire lives. Lockdowns cause chronic stress. Everybody's life has been adversely affected by these lockdowns. Originally it was supposed to be for 3 weeks back in March. We are now being told if we are good boys and girls we will be allowed to have Christmas, though we will probably have to pay for it with a full-blown lockdown afterwards. Lockdowns are just about perfect for the susceptible to develop full-blown depression. We are social creatures and normal human contact is vital to our well-being. Preventing people from seeing their families and best friends for weeks at a time is inhumane. The authorities have deliberately racked up the fear. Millions of people are terrified of a danger they cannot see and cannot understand. This has resulted in a huge mental health crisis, especially amongst the young. The obsession with COVID has pulled resources from the treatment of cancer and heart disease, among others. Thousands of people are going to die of undiagnosed or untreated cancer and heart disease who would not have died if normal care had continued. Apart from a bad diet, which factors are likely to diminish the function of our immune systems? Well, it is well documented that poverty, chronic stress, depression, lack of human contact, fear, and an increase in other physical diseases all combine to damage our immunity, our sanity, and our general health. It is absurd to suggest that long-term lockdowns are good for the health of the nation. There's an old saying that goes, "It's an ill wind that blows nobody any good." So who benefits from a lockdown? Big business benefits from a lockdown at the expense of small local businesses. Supermarkets are thriving. Retailers big enough to have good online businesses are doing well, and the biggest of those, Amazon, is booming. Amazon, that company that pays almost no tax in the UK on its billions of annual profit. In my hometown, there is an excellent indoor market with a wide range of stalls, including a fishmonger, butcher, cheese stall, and greengrocer. Food, surely, is an essential. I cannot shop there because the entire market is closed. Who sits on the SAGE committee that brought us lockdowns? Let's start with who is not on the committee. There is nobody who is an expert in the immune system or immunology. However, 4 of the people on the committee are mathematical modelers, people like Ferguson, who put assumptions into a computer model and accept whatever huge numbers come out of that model. 2 of them are behavioral experts. They are the ones who brought us the fear and the paranoia. 12 of them work for or have received funding from organisations involved in producing a COVID-19 vaccine. 3 work for Imperial College and 2 for Oxford University. Both organisations are receiving millions of pounds from government to develop a vaccine. 3 work for the London School of Hygiene and Tropical Medicine, which has its own vaccine centre. When Chris Whitty was the head of the London School of Hygiene, it received a grant of $40 million from the Gates Foundation, and Bill Gates is hugely invested in vaccines. Patrick Vallance spent his career in charge of drug development at GlaxoSmithKline before he became the government advisor. He is a drug company man through and through. He still holds £600,000 worth of GSK shares, which are likely to rise if GSK produce a successful vaccine. The SAGE committee is riddled with conflicts of interest, pushing them towards a vaccine and ignoring all other options. Matt Hancock didn't know Vallance had a large shareholding in a vaccine-producing company until he read it in a newspaper. Hancock obviously didn't think to ask if any of his advisors had a conflict of interest. He says he doesn't consider it a conflict of interest. It is the very definition of a conflict of interest. Suppose your doctor said you needed to have an operation because you have a very small chance of dying, and an operation will reduce that chance to an even smaller one. The doctor tells you the operation will inevitably cause you a certain amount of emotional, social, physical, and financial distress, which may be mild or very serious depending on your circumstances. What would you do? What would you do if your doctor told you that? Surely, at the very least, you would seek a second opinion from an entirely different and independent expert, at the very least. Johnson and Hancock have never sought the opinion of anyone other than Sage, who we now know have no immunologists on the committee and are full of conflicts of interest. There are plenty of highly qualified, experienced experts in this field who disagree with the government and Sage. But you never hear from them on the mainstream media because no one is allowed to disagree with the government's selected experts, and that is corruption, not science. I am no legal expert, but inflicting months of lockdown on millions of people without any second opinion of its merit sounds to me like criminal negligence. The people who disagree with the government and Sage include Dr. Mike Yeadon, who is the former Chief Scientific Officer and Head of Allergy and Respiratory Research with Pfizer's Global Research and Development. Professor Carl Hennigan is the Director for the Centre for Evidence-Based Medicine at Oxford University. Dr. Suneptra Gupta is an infectious disease epidemiologist, also from Oxford University. She is one of the authors of the Great Barrington Declaration. Professor Michael Levitt is a Professor of Structural Biology at Stanford University and a winner of the Nobel Prize in Chemistry. Each and every one of these is considerably more qualified to advise the government than either Whitty or Vallance. They all vehemently disagree with Ferguson's predictions and the advice of Sage. Their arguments include the following. The Ferguson forecast of 500,000 deaths assumed that nobody had any immunity to this virus. It is a coronavirus, and there are four other coronaviruses which cause the common cold. Healthy people have an innate immune system which can recognize foreign particles which should not be in the body. We have cross-immunity. Our immune cells can recognize and attack viruses which are similar to other viruses they have dealt with previously. This is a coronavirus, and therefore it is not entirely new. T cells can attack and destroy viruses before the need to produce antibodies. Sage said that only 7% of the people had been infected because only 7% had antibodies. According to Dr. Yeadon, this is unacceptable ignorance on the part of Sage. As I have mentioned, the PCR test cannot tell if you are infected. Boris Johnson's moonshot idea of testing everybody in the country is absurd because no tests are perfect. They all produce errors. If the new lateral flow test has any error of, say, 2%, and you test 50 million people, you will get 1 million false positives. 1 million people who will be required to self-isolate for no good reason. That would also make the virus look far worse than it is, bringing on more restrictions in an endless cycle. Young people should not be locked down because the virus does not affect them. It is basic immunological science to know that if you have been infected, you are immune. The experts agree that lockdowns do far more harm than good. One of the reasons is that we do not mix with other people, and we do not come in contact with everyday bacteria and viruses, and our immune response slackens off because then it's not facing any challenge. This makes our immunity to COVID worse, not better. How bad has COVID been? This is a chart of all-cause mortality showing the COVID spike in early 2020 overlaid with the spikes of 2 previous bad flu seasons. There is no difference. This is from a newspaper in February 2018. A severe flu outbreak killed 64,000 people. It made the news, but nobody became hysterical. Nobody suggested the destruction of our local businesses and way of life. COVID-19 is a nasty virus, but it is no worse than a bad flu. So why do we have such a response? They tell us the hospitals are being overrun. This shows critical care occupancy. The blue lines are the 5-year average for November. The red line is the actual figure for November the 8th, 2020. It is below average across every area in England. Here is something else they don't tell you. This is from a Japanese Journal of Infectious Diseases from 2005. Natural infection is well known to be superior to injected vaccines in inducing broad-spectrum cross-immunity. The same message from a very different source, the Children's Hospital of Philadelphia. It is true that natural infection almost always causes better immunity than vaccines. Whereas immunity from disease often follows a single natural infection, immunity from vaccines usually occurs only after several doses. Valence and Whitty should know that. So why didn't they let all but the vulnerable mix during the summer? Because for them it is all about a vaccine, and this proves it. Boris Johnson has had the virus and he is now immune. He has better immunity than if he had been vaccinated. He is isolating for 2 weeks because an app on his phone told him to. He cannot become ill and he cannot infect someone else. This has absolutely nothing to do with science. It is absurd. Johnson is doing this to demonstrate that we all have to do exactly what we are told, no matter how unscientific it is. He wants to enforce the idea that an app on your phone is in control of your life. If Test and Trace says you have been in contact with someone who tests positive, you have to put yourself under house arrest for 2 weeks, even if you are immune. This is not about a virus. I am not anti-vaccine. I'm a medical professional. Vaccines have saved the lives of millions of people. But this is not normal health care. I wonder how many of you are aware that this is all pre-planned. The powers that be have decided that we are all going to need a vaccine passport, and this idea was formalized a few years ago. This is not a response to COVID. They are using COVID to push through their controls over us. If you want to travel abroad, go to a concert, cinema, theatre, sports venue, maybe even a restaurant or pub, you will need your vaccination passport. You will only have any sort of freedom if you agree to let the authorities inject your body with whatever they deem fit to inject it with. Millions of people still believe this is all about being done with our best interests at heart. This trick has been used so many times before. 80 years ago, the French philosopher Albert Camus said, "The welfare of the people in particular has always been the alibi of tyrants." More than 100 years before him, Thomas Paine said, "The greatest tyrannies are always perpetrated in the names of the noblest causes." Health is far more than the absence of disease. True health is a combination of physical, social and mental well-being. The response to the COVID virus has done huge harm to our true health, and the financial price has been enormous. I have tried to tell you what the government and the mainstream media do not tell you. What you think about it and how you feel about it are up to you. I think a lot of people are angry about it, but they feel powerless. To give you another Thomas Paine quote, "Those who expect to reap the blessings of freedom must undergo the fatigue of supporting it," which basically means you have to work to protect your freedoms. I believe the price we have to pay for our health and happiness is to fight back against this tyranny. If you want to know how other people are doing that, please follow the link on the next slide. If this video becomes popular and is seen by many people, it will probably be removed from social media sites. It will be deemed that it spreads misinformation. That is your clear sign that this is a tyranny that will not allow any alternate views.